Thank you. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see so many of you here. And thank you very much to the Art Gallery for asking me back. Frankly, it was a bit of a surprise, but anyway, there we go. I'm here, so thank you. I'm just going to put these down here, but these are going to come in very useful later on when I'm going to need 12 volunteers, so you could have a think about becoming a volunteer. Okay, so you may or may not, possibly not, have noticed that something, I think it's called an election in this country. It was announced last weekend. And so in between several parties, Labour, interestingly spelt without a U, Liberals, the Greens, and Family First, you know, there's a little-known party. It just seems to kind of slip between the cracks, this party. It has a very long history. Its beliefs and principles are drawn from ancient traditions that go back to the Gregorian monks and beyond. The name of this party, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, it's called the Serialist Party. Have any of you heard of that? By the way, they're in a coalition with the atonalists. No? So they're named the Serialist Party in honor of their founder, Arnold Schoenberg. And tonight, I'm proud to say that I'm going to be speaking for the Serialists and showing how you and your working families will not only move forward, but you're also going to be turned upside down as well, and maybe even go backwards sometimes. So, why should you give the Serialists a fair go? Tonight, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Arnold Schoenberg, known as Arnie to his friends, in memory of another politician. Actually, he's still alive, isn't he? So come August 21st, you'll have just a few more options up your sleeve, you know, just not voting for the old favourites. Now, Arnie might not have grown up sleeping in a car. His parents certainly didn't come from Wales, but... Yes, thank you for getting that one. I worked for hours on that joke and nobody laughed. Yes, thank you. Schoenberg did, though, drag himself up by his bootstraps, and he became one of the most iconoclastic figures of the 20th century. And he's also considered nowadays a genius proponent of a completely new musical language. He was the son of a shoeman. You might think, hang on a minute, Robert Schumann Schoenberg, how did that go on? But his father was in fact a shoemaker. And Schumann grew up in Vienna. He grew up in a very poor family, in fact. So his father was a shoemaker, his mother was a piano teacher, his uncle was a singer and also a teacher. He ended up teaching Arnold how to sing and how to speak French, but not necessarily in that order. If you think of Vienna in the late 1800s, so Arnold was born in 1874. So if you think of all the different things that were going on in Vienna in 1874, first of all, well, there wasn't any André Rieu yet. He came a little bit later. But there was all that Strauss music, all those Strauss waltzes. There was also music from the other Strauss coming in, stuff like Don Juan, Ein Heldenleben, maybe not quite that early, but that kind of idea. There was also Mahler and all his weird alpine bells and sort of psychotic dramas. And there was also the sort of the end of Brahms, there's the end of Tchaikovsky. So there was this incredible pot, this incredible melting pot of music. Now, unfortunately, Schoenberg had to leave school when he was 16 because his dad died. And so he had to leave school and he went to work for a private bank. And he was friends with a couple of who are now considered very famous musicians, Oscar Adler, who was a famous violinist, and he also became like a sort of savant, quite a sort of esoteric man. And he was also friends with Zemlinsky. Zemlinsky became a very famous composer. At this time, he wasn't famous yet, and he had studied at the Vienna Conservatory. And Zemlinsky is now considered Schoenberg's only teacher. In fact, Zemlinsky says that he didn't teach Arnold anything. He taught himself. But they used to hang out together. They were so poor that they couldn't go to concerts. the only thing that they could do was to stand outside in the rain and the freezing cold, outside cafes, and listen to concerts being played inside the cafes and inside the concert halls. So if you see students around today just hanging around outside concert halls, have a thought for Arnold Schoenberg and Zemlinsky. They're the future of music. Schoenberg also taught himself to play the cello. He had been taught to play the violin, so he taught himself to play the cello, and that's how he learnt the classical music repertoire, absolutely from the inside, from playing it himself, because he hardly ever went to any concerts. So we've got now to his early 20s. He's still working in a bank, and he's just written a quartet in D major, which I know sounds pretty shocking, but this is about the last piece in which Schoenberg actually uses the name of a key to have on the piece. And then we have something completely shocking, which is a piece just a couple of years later. So this is absolute fin de siècle stuff. 1899, he wrote a piece called Verklärte Nacht, or Transfigured Night. We're going to listen to that in a little bit. This piece breaks down harmony. How many of you have seen the exhibition downstairs, the abstraction exhibition? Okay, so you see that whole path, don't you, going from the Monets, from the Matisses, through to Picasso, through to Cubism, and then through to even more abstract stuff. Music completely mirrors that, and Schoenberg is a perfect example because Schoenberg was also an artist. The thing is, with music, how do we describe abstraction in music? Because music is essentially an abstract art, right? I mean, you can't sort of sing a tune and immediately think, oh, that's a ladder. You sort of, you sort of think more in terms of emotions, I guess. So, to have an idea how we can actually have something a bit more concrete in music, I'm going to get you to do some singing. It's going to be very simple and quick and painless most of the time. Okay, so we need a bass section. You're going to be my bass section. All you lot there, and you at the back. Thank you very much, and the cameraman. And you're going to sing a bass note. How about la, la, let's have that again. La. Okay, thank you. Sing really loud. Okay. Now, harmony is based on lots of different intervals. So it's just like reaching out to a note, and the harmony is the space between these two notes. Basic Western harmony is based on 8 notes apart, which is an octave. So you sing la, and you sing la. All together? La. Okay. Now, the next most basic interval is 5 notes apart. So you sing la, and you sing la. All together? La. Beautiful. No, you're great. Art Gallery of New South Wales Choir, anyone? The next most important interval is the 4th, but it kind of sounds a bit like the 5th, so we won't worry about that. What we're going to go to now is the 3rd. There are 2 types of 3rd. There's a happy 3rd, which is called the major 3rd. So la, la, all together, la. You feel pretty happy, right? Okay, wait till you get this. La, 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 la. Oh, don't you just want to go home and just end it all? Isn't that just the most sad chord? So those intervals, this is like speed harmony, but those are some of the intervals on which the basis, Western harmony is based. They're concrete intervals, and we have a very strong sense of where home is with those intervals. So Schoenberg ended up marrying Zemlinsky, his mate's sister. Her name was Matilda. And Schoenberg decided that at this point that he would go to Berlin. Berlin, the home of cabaret, the home of out-there musicals and, well, lots of tight leather clothing. And, yes, probably quite a lot of drugs and booze and some really out-there music as well. So he went over to Berlin, or up to Berlin, I suppose. And Richard Strauss had heard Verklärte Nacht, the piece that we just heard. Transfigured Night it is, by the way. And he was so impressed that he got Schoenberg a gig teaching at a conservatory. So Schoenberg came back to Vienna, and he started up a musical society with Zemlinsky where they played their own pieces. And he started to teach certain people, like Webern and Berg. They started learning with Schoenberg very, very early on. In 1908, Schoenberg decided that music wasn't quite enough for him, that in a way he knew too much about music and he wanted to do something that he really didn't know anything about, so he decided to take up painting. At the same time, there was a terrible domestic crisis. One of these painters that he got to know, a chap called Richard Gerstel, he started to have an affair with Schoenberg's wife. And Schoenberg found out about it, persuaded his wife to come back for the sake of the children, dear. And so she did come back. Gerstel went off, and he ended up committing suicide. It's around this time that Schoenberg writes his first music that completely abandons any semblance of key. So you know at the beginning of music, we have either no sharps or flats, or we have 6 sharps, or maybe just a couple of flats, something like that. So we have a sense of where we need to put our fingers, and that's a kind of rule for the rest of the piece, the key that we play in. This is the very first piece, or Schoenberg wrote the first piece that didn't have any key signature, and the public reaction was not good. I've got a couple of rather mean things to read out to you. 15 brave musicians presented to us Schoenberg's Chamber Symphony. Chamber of Horrors Symphony would be a more fitting title. That's from a guy who's writing in Berlin in 1913. This is another, I think the same chap in 1912. Herr Schoenberg is a musical spiritualist, at least according to the assurances of his rabid adherents. He writes the music of the future millennia, when the sun will hang in the skies only as a glowing red night lamp, and our great-grandchildren will skate on the equator. Another guy, New York Times, 1913, I fear and dislike the music of Arnold Schoenberg. As he said, the scandal never stopped. So there was this terrible public reaction against Schoenberg's music. It rarely got any better. In 1910, he had this exhibition and became friends with Kandinsky, and exhibited himself with De Blauer Reiter. And he also wrote a harmony teaching book. You may find it surprising that this man who broke all the rules of harmony himself wrote a harmony teaching book, which indeed I use at music college. And I sort of looked at the front cover and went, what? But it's a really fascinating book. He dedicated it to Mahler. He earned absolutely no money from it. In fact, he was so broke at this point, he had to ask Mahler for some rent. He decided to, when he moved back to Berlin in 1911, his music sort of started to become a little bit more successful. We've got Piero Lunaire coming at this point, and in it, he first introduced this idea of Sprechstimme. So you have singers and they go la, or you can have a singer where they go la. And it's that just initial hitting of the note and then coming away from it, a bit like Rex Harrison. You know Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady? He's the perfect example of Sprechstimme. No, he really is, seriously. So Piero Lunaire was quite successful around this time. Also, a huge choral work called Gurrelieder was premiered on the 13th of February, 1913. Remember the number 13? It got a standing ovation. Schoenberg was so completely over the Viennese at this point. They were racist. They were anti-Jewish. They were just horrible. They couldn't stand his work. They suddenly decided that they were going to like it. And Schoenberg just thought, well, stuff you. And I'm just not going to acknowledge your applause at all. So after a 15-minute standing ovation for Gurrelieder, Schoenberg was still sitting there going, nope, I'm not playing. And they got their own back, by the way, a couple of weeks later, because they started throwing things at the orchestra for another concert of his music. Just at this point, a very rich patron shows up, which is just in time because Schoenberg is completely broke. And her name was Frau Leise, and she showed up just in time for World War I. Schoenberg was called up just into the reserve, so he never actually had to fight. But his asthma did start to develop during this time. And he went home, he started teaching more courses for students, especially tailored for individual students. And he tried to do more writing. And in 1918, he started up this Society for Private Musical Performances. Now, one thing that Schoenberg said about his music was that he never wrote bad music. It was just only ever played badly. And I'm embarrassed to say that my partner asked me a couple of days ago when I was doing the research for this, she said, "Oh, so Emma, have you ever played any Schoenberg on my viola or on my cello?" And I said, "Well, yes, I did actually once when I was about 18. After about 8 pints of beer." It sounded really good. So the thing is that musicians don't play Schoenberg a lot, and because we don't play his music a lot, oftentimes, it's probably better now, I was 18 a long time ago, but it's just that kind of thing that we often don't play it well, I think, because it's such difficult music. It's technically difficult music and can be musically challenging. So Schoenberg decided that he would set up this special society. No critics. Pieces would be played more than once in an evening, so you'd get to know the language. There'd be lots of rehearsal time. Schoenberg or one of his friends would do the conducting. And they played pieces by, for instance, Stravinsky, some Bartók, some early Ravel, also Webern. So it was a really important time for a development of Schoenberg's music, because it really was very hard. In fact, he was once told that a violin soloist to play one of his pieces would need to have 6 fingers on the one hand. And you know what Schoenberg's response was? "I can wait." Ironically, I love this, that to raise money for this society, they made arrangements of Johann Strauss, which we do actually occasionally play on Classic Breakfast. It's the only time Schoenberg ever gets played on Classic Breakfast, which I think is a pity. So we've got now to about 1920. It's a bit more interest in his music. There's a festival in Amsterdam for his music, and it's around this time that he starts to work on serialism, the party that you're going to vote for. Now, for this, I need 12 volunteers. It's completely easy. It's not embarrassing. You just have to hold up a piece of paper. Yes, everybody at the front. Would you like to come and stand here? Would you mind? No, seriously, I do actually need 12 volunteers. Okay, so I was thinking, how am I going to explain serialism? And I was thinking, I'll use a sentence. And I was thinking, what's a really famous sentence, especially from around this time? Okay, it's a little bit later. It was written in 1948, but miraculously, this sentence has 12 words in it. And the words are, all creatures are equal, but some creatures are more equal than others. Which totally explains serialism. So the idea behind serialism is to take away any dominance of one note. When we listen to a piece by Bach, if it's in G major, we hear a lot of Gs, and we hear a lot of the note which is 5 notes above that, which is a D. In serialism, all notes are equal, and in fact, some notes aren't more equal than others. They're all the same. What Schoenberg did in his serialism is that he wrote something called a tone row. And in a tone row, you use all 12 semitones in an octave. It doesn't have to be it can be in any order, so that's where the artistry comes in. So he writes this tone row, and then he makes variations of the tone row. This is the first variation of the tone row. Creatures are equal, but some creatures are more equal than others, all. Interesting. Can the next person please go to the other end? We'll do this quickly in a minute. Okay. Are equal, but some creatures are more equal than others, all creatures. So can you see what's starting to happen? I think we don't quite have time to go through all of it. But also what happens is that we start to go backwards. So if you read now the row backwards, it's starting to really change. And we're using the same notes, but we're using them in retrograde. Now, what also happens with Schoenberg is that he took notes, and if he had the first two notes just a tone apart, la, la, then he would do an inversion as well. So you go a tone down, la, la, like that. So from these 12 notes, just this simple beginning, an incredibly complex piece of music would be formed. It wouldn't only be linear like this. If you imagine stretching out from each of these 12 words, the rest of the 11 words, then you have a pure Schoenberg grid. And that's what his music sounded like. It's really like Bach. It's contrapuntal. There are many lines going on. It's it's endlessly fascinating. Thank you very much to my volunteers. Thank you. The thing about Schoenberg, his serialism, is that I think that it's incredibly beautiful. If you look at some of the pictures downstairs, you know the ones just as you go in, there's a lack of light. There's a lot of pictures that are painted almost in darkness, and you start to see things that you might not notice if there was full light on the picture. And I kind of see Schoenberg's music a little bit like that. So I've got a question for you. It's not something that you have to answer now, but it's something that it's been thinking about for years, really. If we all listen to Schoenberg from birth, if our mothers played a Schoenberg when we're in utero, would we love Schoenberg? What do you think? Like, is our complete acceptance of more tonal music, is that simply because we're used to it? And do we not take Schoenberg into our hearts so readily because we just hardly ever hear his music? It kind of goes along with that Noam Chomsky idea that, because he believes that grammar is innate, and so Leonard Bernstein believed that a love of tonality was innate. But I don't know, I'm not too sure about it. Answers on a postcard, please. Thank you very much. So we're now going to jump forward a little bit to 1924, 1925. So it's around this time that Schoenberg's wife dies, her name Matilda. Schoenberg is utterly distraught and gets married less than a year later to a woman called Gertrude. And they moved back to Berlin. They moved between Vienna and Berlin quite a lot, mostly to try and get some money and get a gig. So Schoenberg gets a gig in Berlin at the Academy of Arts. He takes over from Busoni, in fact. And this is pretty much the only time in Schoenberg's life where he's really happy. He has a lot of autonomy. He doesn't have to work that much. He can do his own courses. And then guess who comes along? Yes, Hitler. He comes along and ruins it all. So at one point, he had this wonderful job, and then Hitler came along and the Nazis and said, right, we want to get rid of all the Jewish elements in this academy. And Schoenberg just took this as his cue to get the hell out of there, which he did. He moved, first of all, to France and formally rejoined the Jewish faith. And then in 1934, moved to the United States, to a place which was considered completely and utterly devoid of any intelligence. Correct, Los Angeles. Some things don't change, do they? So 1934, actually he moved to Boston first and then he moved to LA, became really good friends and tennis partners with Gershwin. Can you imagine the rhythm of those matches? It would have been really fascinating. There's a story which I heard about Schoenberg when he was living in Brentwood, possibly a little bit before O.J. Simpson. And thank you for laughing at my jokes. Thank you very much. I know, they're really bad. So anyway, I was living in Brentwood, and he had a friend come and visit from over the other side of the States. And Schoenberg was walking down the street, with his very serious tie on, a bit of a frown. And all these young kids were saying, hello, Mr. Schoenberg, and calling out from the other side of the street, hey, "Hey, Mr. Schoenberg, how are you going?" And Arnold would say, hello, and take his hat off to them and all this sort of stuff. And this friend was so impressed. These American kids, how fantastic is American education that they know all about this ultra forward-thinking serialist, serious composer from Vienna. And so he said to Arnold, "I'm so impressed with these young children. It's great that they know such a wonderful composer." And he said, "Oh, no, it's because of my son. He's captain of the high school football team." Never mind. They knew about him eventually. He was also asked to write for a few films. One director came up to him one day and said, "Mr. Schoenberg, I've got this scene. There's a plane crash, and there's a ball of flame. 200 people die. And then there's this whole bunch of flames that go across a field. Will you please write music for it?" And he said, if there's that much stuff going on, why do you need my music? In fact, he even said that, "I'll write a piece of music and you direct a film to it." So he didn't get on very well with the filmmakers in LA. In fact, he got really depressed, and he kind of wanted to go back to Europe. Very depressing news, terrible news from Europe was starting to come in. And in 1944, he was diagnosed with diabetes, and he had to give up a professorship that he had at UCLA. He had a heart attack, had to have a direct injection right into his heart, which is when he wrote that string trio. And at this point, he only had a few private students, including John Cage, who he thought was really dumb, which is really interesting. And in his final years, he was completely withdrawn. There was becoming a bit more interest in his music at this point. And one of the few happy things that happened towards the end of his life was honorary president of the Israel Academy of Music in 1951. Now, just a couple more things about Schoenberg before we end this talk. Do you know that Schoenberg was utterly, fearfully afraid of the number 13? It's interesting because he was born on the 13th of a certain month, I can't quite remember what. And on Friday, the 13th of July, 1951, Schoenberg was 76, adds up to 13. He stayed in bed. He was up there with his sister, and they were looking at the clock, and he was thinking, "Oh, please just let it get past 12, get past midnight, and I'll be safe, and I'll be away from this 13th. It was a Friday. And so he looked at the clock, and it had just gone beyond midnight, and so his sister went downstairs, and she came back up, and Schoenberg was dead. And what had happened was that the clocks upstairs were fast. And in fact, it was only 11:45. And so Schoenberg was born and died on the 13th died on the 13th of July. So what type of man was he? What sort of man would you want to vote for? Well, I can promise that he never wore budgie smugglers. I don't think that he ran triathlons, but I can't say for certain. I do know that he never, ever dyed his hair red and left little bits of grey just at the roots that you can see in photographs. He was tenacious, he was resilient, he was a highly optimistic man. Hello, you'd have to be. Check out that criticism, gosh. He was also an autodidact, and he believed that he only benefited from others teaching him if he had already learnt it himself. He was a creative, wonderfully larrikin teacher who despised knowledge purely for its own sake, and he believed that the most important thing to teach was staying true to your own original idea, no matter what the cost. And he also believed that his musical developments were a logical outcome of a tradition which obeyed fundamental laws. And although he felt impelled to write this music, which he called pantonal, not atonal, he recognized that it was difficult to defend. And in the end, he fell to God, to protection, and for reasoning for this work. Many people consider Schoenberg the most important composer since J.S. Bach. And I have to say, I kind of agree. When you're voting on August the 21st, somewhere down the bottom of your slips will be a little tiny box for the Serialist Party. It will be in very, very small print. What can you expect from the Serialist Party? Well, you can expect a special celebration of the number 13. You can also expect free music education and daily broadcasts of atonal music on the ABC. And finally, and most importantly, you can expect equality for every note. Vote 1 for the serialists. Preferences are, perhaps surprisingly, going to the neoclassicists. Authorised by Schoenberg, spoken by Ayres, Canberra. Thank you very much.